Professor Monier, Professor Kendall, members of the Academy, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to be here and to give this lecture named after two really great people, as was explained, Etienne Wolf and Srinivasa Ramanujan. It's a great honor to do that. It's also overwhelming, this hall, and all the people who are going to listen to my lecture. I have to live up to the expectations of all these people and all of you in the room. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to do this. I have called my lecture Cooperation and Conflict in a Tropical Insect Society. As was mentioned, one way to describe me is that I am an insect sociologist. I'm interested in why and how insects live together as a society and how they function, how they solve the same problems that we face because we live in societies, and how they harness the advantages of living in a society which we also face. So to very briefly introduce the idea of insect societies, it turns out that many species of insects, not all, but many species of insects live in societies, what you might call societies. And these societies, if you study them, they are very similar to human societies. In some ways, one can make the argument that they are superior to human societies. Not enough is known about them, but as human beings who live in societies, we cannot fail to be interested in understanding such insect societies. So here is one such insect society, and you can see the population density of the wasps sitting very close to each other, sometimes on each other, already creates a problem of the kind that we sometimes face in large cities, and there are many such things can be envisioned. But perhaps the best known example of insect societies is not this wasp that I study, but of course is the honeybee, which everybody is familiar with. Honeybees live always in large colonies. A single honeybee taken out of our hive will die within a few hours. She cannot live outside the society. When inside the society, they live in such crowded colonies. And if you examine these bees carefully, you will find that there are three kinds of bees. There is always one and only one large, fertile female bee, which we call the queen bee. There are varying numbers, but usually fairly small numbers, maybe a few hundred, male bees, which are called drones. And the rest of the colony, which may number 30, 40, 50, 60,000 individuals, all are these smaller, nearly sterile, so-called worker bees. One of the most important features of such a society is, like in modern human society, there is very clear division of labor. It's very clearly decided who will do what. In this particular case, the queen does only two things. She lays eggs. So she eats, converts her diet into eggs, and she lays eggs. She can lay thousands of eggs per day. In fact, there is very little else she does. In fact, this is the only thing she does actively. She does one more thing quite passively, and that is through her metabolic machinery, she produces many different kinds of chemical molecules and releases them outside her body, which are important for regulating the whole colony. But that she does passively. What she does actively is just this. Now, the drones are famously lazy. They don't do anything. They do not contribute to work in the colony. They are born in colonies. They wait until they mature. And when they are mature, they fly out of the colony of their birth in search of virgin queens born in other colonies to inseminate them. And once they inseminate them, they die. Indeed, they die in the act of copulation. So there's no chance of their inseminating another individual. They actually die. And that's all they do in their life. All the work that is required to run the society, to build the nest, to clean the nest, to feed the larvae, to bring food, to process food, to remove dead bees, to guard the nest. All the work is done by these so-called worker bees. Even the worker bees organize their work very systematically. What a bee will do on a given day is dictated by two things: her age and the needs of the colony. Her age not measured in days, but measured relative to the other bees. Am I one of the oldest bees? Then this is what I'm supposed to do. Am I one of the youngest bees in the colony? Then that is what I'm supposed to do. Am I a middle-aged bee? Then this is something else you can do. And this helps them to make sure that all the work that is needed in the colony actually gets done. Here's a picture of a queen bee. You can see she's larger than the rest, and she's typically surrounded by small groups of worker bees. And this group of worker bees we call the royal retinue of workers. They are, in some sense, in charge of the queen. Their job is to take care of the queen. They lick the queen, they clean the queen, they feed the queen, and they move along with the queen wherever she is moving in the colony. You might, of course, depending on your perspective, decide that she is getting royal treatment or that she is a prisoner of the workers around her because she cannot do anything else on her own. And presumably they do all of this for her because she is too busy. She has no time. She is laying eggs, moving around the colony, finding a place, an empty cell, and laying eggs, and they do all of this for her. But in the process of servicing the queen in this fashion, they inadvertently acquire the chemicals that she is producing, and that tells them what to do. It also tells them how healthy the queen is. If the chemicals tell them that the queen is old, sick, dying, then they replace the queen. So it works both ways. Here's a picture of a worker bee. Workers typically work at home for the first half of their lives, building, cleaning, processing food, feeding larvae, etc. And in the second half of their life, they leave their home and they fly outside in search of food. Their food consists of pollen grains and nectar, both of which they gather from flowers. And here is a picture where you can see that the bee has actually gathered quite a bit of pollen on her hind legs. There are structures in the hind legs which we call pollen baskets. And it has been observed that when the worker bee is flying home, she does not actively pick up pollen. Pollen accidentally rubs onto her body when she's moving from flower to flower. And when on her way home, she brushes her body and pushes all of that pollen into two tight packets in the pollen baskets of her hind legs. She has 3 pairs of legs, and she goes home and deposits this. Nectar she drinks, but does not completely swallow. There is a little organ called the crop where she saves it, where it does not get digested, and she goes home and she regurgitates this to the waiting bees at home. Usually bees find much more food than they can individually handle. And so bees have evolved a mechanism of going back home and recruiting naive foragers to come and help them to transport the food back home. And this they do by what is famously known as the honeybee dance language. So the bees go home and perform a dance, and through this dance they communicate information about what they have found, how far away, how to get there. All of this information is conveyed to the bees at home, and by watching the dance, the bees understand this, and now without further help from the original bee, they can go to this site, which may be 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers away, one particular tree, and find and transport that food back home. I am an evolutionary biologist, and for an evolutionary biologist, even more spectacular than all of this is the fact that bees are altruistic. That is, they are willing to sacrifice themselves for the welfare of their colony. The fact that most workers die working throughout their life without ever having children of their own is already an act of altruism from the point of view of genetics, because they don't have any Darwinian fitness. But even more spectacular, honeybees can commit suicide for the welfare of the colony. If you disturb a colony, bees will unhesitatingly fly out and sting you. But stinging is an act of suicide, because when a honeybee stings you, the sting, the poison gland, and part of her digestive system are attached to your body. And when she tries to fly away, she cannot withdraw this sting because the sting has thorns pointing outwards, and therefore her abdomen ruptures. And she leaves behind the sting, the poison gland, and part of her digestive system hanging on your body, flies away, only to die within a few minutes. It turns out that this poison gland, which is still sticking to your body, can continue to pump venom. It's filled with venom, and it can continue to pump venom into your body. And people have actually measured this by taking volunteers of this kind up to 60 seconds after the owner of the poison gland has flown away. So next time you're stung by a bee, don't chase the flying bee. She's not going to harm you or anybody else. She's going to die within a few minutes. But try and identify this sting and remove it from your body before all the venom actually enters your body. Honeybees are famous examples of insect societies, but we also have many, many others. We have ants. There are something like 15,000 species of ants, each species making its own intricate society with its own rules and regulations. I'll mention one thing that the ants have done, which the bees have not done, and that is their division of labor is even more spectacular, because different worker ants do different jobs, and they are born with the body, shape, size, structure, physiology suitable for that particular job. So they are actually born to do a particular job. And you can see here in this drawing that these ants all are very different in shape and size, but they all are members of the same species. In fact, individuals taken out from the same colony, which a very famous ant scientist and myrmecologist studied in the early part of the 20th century. Now, this difference between individuals has actually been taken to an extreme by ants. And in order to fulfill the role that they have in their colony, they are born very different. And therefore, in ants, you find the record intraspecies, intrasexual dimorphism, variation from one individual to the other. The world's record of that is this ant from Malaysia. It turns out in this ant, the largest member of the colony is this, and the smallest member of the colony has been placed on the head of the largest member of the colony before taking the scanning electron micrograph by my friend Mark Moffett when he was a graduate student in Harvard. And it turns out that this ant is 500 times the size of this ant. And I like to remind my molecular biology colleagues always that these two ants come from the same genome. It's just epigenetics that makes this huge difference. You give me an ant, egg, and you order whether you want this or this, and I can supply you whichever you want from the same egg ant. Then, of course, we have the wasps, which are my favorite insect societies. Most wasps are not social. They are either solitary or they are what we call parasitic. But a few thousand species of wasps are social, and the social wasps are called paper wasps. And the reason why they're called paper wasps is because they build their nest not from wax as honeybees do, not from leaves as ants do, not from soil as termites do, but indeed from paper. Where do they get the paper from? They manufacture paper. How do they manufacture paper? In exactly the same way that we manufacture paper. They scrape cellulose fibers from plants, they chew it up, add chemicals, make it into a nice pulp, spread it into a thin layer, and dry it, and it's paper. You can write on it. This is a nest of a particularly aggressive wasp, but the whole nest is covered with a paper envelope, leaving just a small opening here for the wasp to go in and out. And if you are courageous enough to remove this envelope, which I did once when I was young, I don't think I would do it again, but when you remove that, then you are in for a treat. You see what I like to call a multi-storied apartment complex. So you have here several layers of paper comb, and this is where they actually rear their nest. Now, for detailed study, I did not choose this species for obvious reasons. I chose this much smaller, much more beautiful, much less aggressive species. The only problem is that this species is a predator of this species, and I'll tell you in a minute how I deal with that problem, but this is the wasp that I like to study. As I said, I like to describe myself as an insect sociologist, which means I'd like to understand how these societies work. And I always remind myself and my students that we have to be very cautious in doing this work. We must always ask ourselves, can we really understand an insect society? We speak English, Kannada, Hindi, French. They speak some other language. Can we really understand? And I think this is an important question we should keep in mind, and we should be modest about our claims that we have understood. We must keep on verifying whether what we have understood really is valid. And I like to go back to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who cautioned us that nature loves to hide. And this Heraclitus picture, which we look at regularly, gives us caution in our work. But we also like to listen to another philosopher, came much later, Sir Francis Bacon, in the 16th, 17th century, and he said, nature does not unveil its secrets except under the torture of experiments. So you can do experiments, and there is hope. So between caution and hope, we try our best. And I will not claim that I have understood everything about insect society. In fact, I would try to present my work in such a way that you decide whether I have understood or not. And you may have decided that I have not understood and may come to a different understanding from the same thing. So I'll try and present my lecture in that fashion. But people, of course, not only ask me whether you think you can understand, they also ask me, why do you bother? Why do you study wasps in the first place? And people study insect societies for many, many different things. They have applications in pharmacology, in medicine, in ergonomics, in sociology, in communication science, and you have applications to internet. But I study wasps for the following reason. Why do you study social wasps? People often ask me. For the same reason that an anthropologist studies humans is my answer. Anthropologists can offer us a glimpse into the lives and mores of primitive and exotic human societies. That's why anthropologists study primitive societies. Biologists can do much more. They can offer us insights from a whole range of animal societies with millions of years of evolutionary history, which no human society can match. And those of us who are lucky enough to study insect societies can hope to harness wisdom. The operative word here is wisdom, not instruction. Wisdom from an altogether different subkingdom of life. People also ask me, but how do you study them? It's usually very paradoxical for people that you can study these. So how do you actually, it is not very difficult to study them. How do we study them? First and foremost, the biggest mystery that people have is there are hundreds, maybe thousands of individuals. How do you know who is who? It turns out that we can actually color code all of these wasps. We can put little spots of colored paint of different colors on the different parts of the body of each ant. Then every wasp gets a name, and there is a computer file for every wasp, and then we can keep on adding information about this wasp to that computer file. We have this for thousands and thousands of wasps throughout their life, all information about them. We have dossiers on all of these wasps. We can identify every wasp as a wasp. We can study them wherever they occur in nature, but we can also bring them to the laboratory and put them in cages of this kind. A little plastic box, if there's one or two wasps, bigger wooden cage if there are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, but we can also keep the door of the cage open and allow the wasps to go in and out. Because if we bring their nest here, then they will come. We know they will come back here. They will not go away. So what we do is we bring wasps to the laboratory and we stack them in various cages like this. Some cages are closed, depending on the experiment. Some are open. But my laboratory does not have walls. It simply has wire mesh on all four sides. And the size of the wire mesh has been so adjusted that my wasp can freely go in and out, and the predator wasp cannot come inside. So that's the only thing I do. I protect them from predators, but I don't do anything else to them. They go find their own food, they leave, they come back, they bring somebody. They're free to do whatever they want. So it's an almost natural situation. So this is the species I study. Now, for this particular talk, I want to focus on a theme. And the theme, as I mentioned in the title of my talk, is cooperation and conflict. When individuals live together, whether it is humans or primates or birds or insects, you have great opportunities for cooperation. In fact, you will not survive unless you cooperate. But you also have great temptation for conflict. And I don't think you can separate these two. They're always present. Cooperation and conflict are two sides of the same coin. And the question I'm really interested in is, how do the wasps manage this balance between cooperation and conflict? When is cooperation winning and when is conflict winning, and why? And can we go from one to the other? Can we understand the principles such that we can actually do something to the wasp and increase the cooperation or increase the conflict, which gives us confidence that we have understood? So that's roughly the kind of thing I want to do. But before I get on to that, I do want to make a point about science. Now, I think the process of doing science, the way we do science, is as important as the product that we actually find. But unfortunately, most scientists are only interested in communicating the product. When we talk to our students, when we talk to our colleagues, when we talk to public, we only say what we have found. And we shy away from saying how we have found this. And I think this is a shame, because it gives the false impression that science is like magic. And only scientists can know the truth, and nobody else can know, and everybody else is supposed to believe what they say. And I think this is very unfortunate. We must spend more time talking about it. I would argue that the process, or communicating the process, is even more important than communicating the product, because the product may be only interest some people. The process may be of interest to a wider number of people. So I will try my best to communicate the process by which we do our science and tell you a little about what we might have found. And so typically research in my research group begins like that. I work with a large number of students, and we all love this wasp. So one condition for becoming my student is that you should love this wasp. And it's not hard to find such students, because they are really fascinating creatures. You can sit and watch them for hours and hours and not get bored. And especially if you have them color-coded, then it's a feast to watch them. So our major activity is to watch the wasp for fun. Now, as we watch the wasp for fun, if you have a trained mind, if you are a scientist, you begin to ask some questions. Why do they do this? How do they do that? These questions inevitably arise in your mind, and then you start thinking about these questions. Many of these questions you would think, I have no idea, and I'll probably never find out. But every now and then there is a question you say, I think I can try and answer this question. And then we begin to design a research project to answer a question. We develop a methodology, we design experiments, we do statistics, we collect data, and we try and answer a question. Sometimes we fail, but sometimes we succeed, or we think we succeed. But inevitably when we succeed, we are not ready for celebrating and having a party, because it's very bothersome, because a new question arises in your mind saying, how can this be true? What I have found cannot be true, because something else has to happen, and how is it possible? That leads to your next question. And then we repeat the whole process, and this goes from question to question to question. That's how research proceeds now. And when you are run out of questions, watch the wasp for fun. It's always fun to watch them. So I have designed this lecture as a series of questions and answers. I will tell you what questions we asked, how we tried to answer them, what we think was the answer, and you can then decide whether it's a reasonable answer. But I'll also tell you how that led to the next question. The next question, which we could not have even thought of before answering this question. So this was the fundamental thing about these was, so these questions and answers. The main difference, or one of the differences between this wasp and the honeybee which I showed you, is that in this species also there is a single queen. Only one individual reproduces. Everybody else works for her, and the males are lazy. But the difference is in the honeybee, you immediately know who the queen is. She's a large, fertile, big, special individual. But here, they all look the same. And yet, one of these is the queen. And she's the only one who will reproduce. And everybody accepts her as the queen. And said, how can this be possible? There must be something different she does so that everybody knows that she's the queen. So the question we asked is, how does the queen behave as compared to the rest? Does she behave in any special way? Now, how do you answer this question? So first, what I did was, I said, let me make a list of the various things that the wasps do. In plain English, they sit, they fly, they walk, they feed the larvae, they bite each other, they bring food, they build the nest, they repair the nest, They bring water, they cool the nest. So just make a long list of all the things they do in some reasonable practical chunks. I ended up with about 100 such activities, and I asked which of these does the queen do and which of these do the workers do. It turned out about of the 100, the workers did 99 and the queen did 99 plus 1, which is lay eggs. So there was no difference between the queen and the workers. So it occurred to me that the difference must be quantitative. Everybody does everything, but not to the same extent. The quantitative difference may define who is the queen. So I devised methods of calculating for every wasp what fraction of her time, of waking time, does she devote to each behavior, or how many times does she perform each behavior per hour. So I made these calculations for all the wasps, including the queen, and at that time I didn't worry about who the queen is. I simply calculated this for all the wasps. So I got a huge data matrix. Wasps' behaviors. In the cell you have proportion of time and you have frequency of performance per hour. This kind of data is the most obvious thing to do with this kind of data is to subject it to multivariate statistical analysis, which is what I did. And I did this, and then I did some kind of a pattern analysis to see if there is a pattern in the variation. First of all, I got a lot of quantitative variation between different wasps. And is there a pattern in this variation? So I did some cluster analysis, and I found to my surprise that there are 3 kinds of wasps in every colony. And I called these 3 kinds sitters, fighters, and foragers based on their main behaviors. So the sitters seem, to us at least, to most of the time just sit and do nothing. They look like lazy individuals. The fighters are aggressive individuals. They are biting, nudging, chasing, nibbling other wasps in the colony. That's the most striking thing to do. We call them fighters. And then there are very hard-working wasps. They spend most of the time outside the nest and return with food or building material, and we call them the foragers. Until this point, we did not worry who is the queen. In other words, we did not tell our computer who the queen is. The computer gave us this result. That was a great advantage because now we can go back and ask, where is the queen? Is she a sitter? Is she a fighter? Is she a forager? Common sense suggested very strongly that the queen must be a fighter. And the reason for this is that other species which had been studied before this, it was discovered that in such species where the queen does not look different from the workers, the queen rules by physical aggression. She uses physical aggression both to ensure that her workers do not become queens and to ensure that they actually work. They go out and bring food and feed it to the larvae and clean the nest. They use physical aggression by doing this. So our queen, of course, must be a fighter. And to our great surprise, we found that our queen is not a fighter. In every colony that we studied, our queens are lazy sitters. So how does the queen behave differently? The queen is a non-aggressive, non-interactive, meek and docile sitter. Why is this unsettling? Because how can this be true? If the queen is such a meek and docile sitter, how did she become a queen in the first place? Why do the workers accept her as their queen? If she's an aggressive individual, biting everybody and suppressing everybody, it's easy to see why they would accept. Why do our wasps accept her as their queen in the first place? Now, in order to answer this question, we realize that more observation is not sufficient. We've already observed all we can, so we have to do an experiment. So we designed an experiment to answer this question. The experiment, a little bit into the mic?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay. We designed an experiment to try and answer the question, and the experiment involved studying a colony for a whole day. And by studying here, of course, what I mean is that mark the wasp and calculate the proportion of time each wasp spends in each behavior. And at the end of the day, early next morning, physically, experimentally, just remove the queen from the colony. You can take a forceps and you can pick the queen and take her off the colony. And on the second day, you study the whole colony again without the queen. The same study, but now without the queen. And when we did this on the first occasion, at the end of day 2, we had this queen sitting in a glass bottle. We had given her some honey to drink, and she seemed very happy. And we quite didn't know what to do with her. And it seemed to me, why not try and put her back? Because the experiment is over. Now, why destroy her when we didn't know what would happen? So we said, we'll try. And when we released her back to the colony, she quietly went back to the colony and started behaving like a queen. And nobody bothered. And that was perfectly fine. So now what we do is we do the experiment for 3 days with queen, without queen, and returned queen. And every day we study all the wasps in the colony. And with this, we hope to understand why do they accept this queen in the first place. Now, when we removed the queen, something totally unexpected, rather spectacular happened. This species is a reasonably peaceful society. There are some fighters, there is some biting and aggression and nudging and so on, but on the whole, it's a relatively peaceful colony. But as soon as we removed the queen, it became an extremely aggressive society. The levels of aggression, and we call these aggression as dominance-subordinate behaviors, because through the aggression we can classify who is the winner and who is the loser, who is dominant, who is subordinate, and we can actually construct a hierarchy of all the individuals. This is the most dominant, second, third. So we call them dominant-subordinate behaviors, and the numbers of dominant-subordinate behaviors increase dramatically as soon as you remove the queen. In some colonies, 2-fold, 4-fold, 10-fold. We have a record of 40-fold increase in aggression, in dominance behavior, as soon as you remove the queen. What was even more surprising is that all of this new aggression was shown by one and only one of the workers. So this is what the data would look like. Day 1, nobody shows much aggression. You can see the maximum is about 3 to 4 acts per hour. Remove the queen, you have 35 acts per hour in 1 hour. And return the queen, and even that aggressive individual actually stops being aggressive. Then we asked, what would happen if you don't return the queen? If you don't return the queen, in fact, this aggression drops to 0 in a few days. But this individual, this hyper-aggressive individual, will in fact become the queen on the 6th day. She will actually lay her first egg on the 6th or 7th day. So we called this hyper-aggressive individual the potential queen. So you are a potential queen on the day you become hyper-aggressive until you lay the first egg. Once the first egg is laid, of course, she's entitled to the term queen. So you're a worker, then you become a potential queen, and then you can become a queen. So the answer is indeed that potential queens begin their careers as very aggressive individuals and only later become meek and docile. So at the time they are being accepted as the queen, they are indeed very nasty and aggressive individuals, and that is why the wasps accept them. But how can this be true? Well, if that is the correct answer, how does a meek and docile queen continue to inhibit reproduction by her workers, make sure they do not reproduce for her entire career, which may be 1 year, several months? For several months, they completely respect her. They do not lay eggs if she is present. If you remove her, they can lay eggs, but she will not. How can she command this respect, this obedience, by being aggressive for 1 week? In fact, many individuals would be born after she stopped being aggressive. You can't even say that they remembered her aggression. Well, how does this happen? So obviously, there's some other mechanism, not aggression, by which she controls worker reproduction. And in order to answer this question, we designed a different experiment. And in this experiment, we actually brought the colony and put it in a closed cage. And on day 1, we studied the whole colony exactly as before. And on day 2, instead of removing the queen, we removed all the wasps from the cage. We took a knife and we cut the nest in half, 2 parts. And in the middle, we inserted a wire mesh screen. The purpose of the wire mesh was to prevent the wasp from going through, but allow volatiles to go through. Whatever volatile chemicals she goes will go through. And now we study both sides. And this is what it looks like. Queen plus workers, undivided colony, divided colony. And the way we did this was after we removed all the wasps and put the wire mesh screen, we picked up each wasp and tossed a coin. Heads, you go left, tails, you go right. Next wasp, heads, you go left, tails, you go right. Finally, the queen, heads, you go left, tails, you go right. And on the third day, what we did was we simply took the queen and moved her from one side to the opposite side and did not disturb the workers. And we studied these, and we studied all of these, and we studied the behavior, all of these. Our predictions were as follows. If the queen pheromone, that is the chemical she produces, which potentially can suppress worker reproduction, instead of physical aggression, there's a chemical aggression, chemical castration, if you like. If those chemicals are volatile, then both of these fragments should behave as if they have a queen, because these wasps can easily smell the chemicals that is being produced by this wasp across the wire mesh. And therefore, both of these fragments should behave as if they have a healthy queen. There's no reason to worry. But if the queen pheromone is non-volatile, then these workers will think that they don't have a queen, because they cannot sense the chemical on this side, which is non-volatile. And they should think they don't have a queen. And what does that mean? There should be a potential queen. There should be one worker becoming hyper-aggressive and wanting to become the next queen, because they don't have a queen anymore. And when we move the queen from the left to the right, of course, the potential queen on this side should go back to work because the queen has returned, and a different worker here should become aggressive and try to become the next queen. Now, this turns out to be a very nice experiment. We have used this experiment to answer many different questions. So by today, we have done this experiment many, many, many times. But even when this slide was made, this experiment had already been done 24 times. And in every time, prediction 2 is upheld, suggesting, in fact, that, okay, so this is what the data would look like. Day 1, nobody is aggressive. Day 2, one individual is aggressive on the queen-less side. Move the queen to her side, she drops her aggression, but a different individual then becomes hyper-aggressive. Now we can go back post facto and ask, what was this individual doing on day 2? She was showing no aggression. What was she doing on day 1? No aggression. What was this individual doing on day 1? No aggression. What does she do on 3? No aggression. And so Ropalidia marginata queens appear to use non-volatile pheromones to inhibit worker reproduction, is our answer. But if this is true, how does she regulate the non-reproductive activities? In other species, the queen uses physical aggression both to prevent the workers from reproducing, but also to make sure they work and are not just lazy. Now, we can imagine that our queen produces a pheromone which enters the body of the workers, has a physiological effect on her ovaries, and prevents them from laying eggs. But it's hard to imagine that she produces a chemical which says, go and work. Why should they obey? So it's unlikely that the non-volatile pheromone will be regulating work. So there must be some other method by which she makes sure that her workers actually work. So we had to design another experiment. And in this experiment, we said, let us study non-reproductive activity, work, carefully. Let us choose 2 prominent examples of non-reproductive work, and we chose bringing food to the colony, which is very important, and feeding it to the young ones, to the larvae. So we chose these 2 behaviors, and we said, let us look at this very closely. Who does it? When? And what happens when the queen is not there? So we removed the queen. So in the normal colony, we observed these behaviors very carefully, and we removed the queen and observed these behaviors carefully. And of course, as before, we put the queen back and observed these behaviors very carefully. And to our great surprise, we found that the workers don't care. They do not need instructions from the queen. They bring food at the same rate, day 1 with queen, without queen, queen returned. There is no difference in the rate at which they bring food to the colony. There is no statistical difference in the rate at which they feed the larvae. With queen, without queen, queen returned. So workers do the work themselves. They don't need to be told to do work as in other species. In fact, we have concluded that Ropalidia marginata, that's the scientific name of our species, they do not regulate non-reproductive work of their foragers. But if this is true, somebody must regulate. Somebody must tell the workers what to do, how much work is needed. So there still is a problem to be solved. Every problem that you solve creates a new problem that needs to be solved. And that is what actually keeps us going. And so we said there must be. And we suspected that even though this is a relatively peaceful colony, the fighters keep a little bit of aggression. And we thought maybe that aggression performs this function. So we asked ourselves, what is the function of the low level of dominance behavior shown by the workers in a normal colony when the queen? Why do they do this? What is the function of this? And we hypothesized actually that this may be used for the workers to tell each other that work is needed, food is needed, larvae are hungry, please work. And they may be using this. So we gathered 3 lines of evidence in support of this hypothesis. First, we simply watched this very carefully and we showed, so this was our, we showed that the fraction of dominance behavior received by workers and their contribution to work is positively correlated. Weakly, but statistically significantly positively correlated, supporting the idea that this may be used for this kind of decentralized self-regulation of the workers. But of course, this is a correlation. One should not infer causal relations from correlations. One should do experiments. One should isolate factors. And in this case, it's actually possible to do experiments. So the experiments we did was we said, if this is true, and if everybody is well fed, nobody is hungry, there should be no dominance behavior. And it is actually possible to do this. So one of my students learned how to make sure that all the wasps are very well fed. So she actually learned to hand feed the wasp. So she would take a piece of food, which is caterpillar, a piece of caterpillar in her forceps, and she would sit in front of the wasps. And initially the wasps were afraid of her, but eventually they came and grabbed the food and ran away. Then she gave them some more, and they came and took it and ran away. She gave them some more, and they were all completely satisfied. But she gave them some more, so they took what she gave and started feeding the larvae. And at the end of the day, everybody was completely satiated, the adults and the workers, and they didn't need any food. Now she measured the rates of dominance behavior. And she actually showed that rate of bringing food came down because of being overfed, feeding larvae came down, dominance behavior came down. Indeed, the dominance received behavior directed toward the foragers came down very significantly, giving us confidence in this hypothesis. But you can also do the converse experiment. You can say, if I starve the wasps, there should be more dominance behavior. This another student did, but he had it easy because all he had to do was to close the cage and not feed the wasps, and they would be hungry. And this student showed that starvation actually increases dominance behavior. In particular, this group of students showed that when animals are starved, they are not just randomly showing aggression to everybody else, but in particular the foragers are attacked. So those wasps which are known to bring food yesterday are specifically attacked today when everybody is hungry. So we argue that, in fact, this is our, I skipped that slide, this is our answer. Worker dominance behavior is indeed used for the decentralized self-regulation of foraging by the workers themselves. So the queens don't have to do it, but the workers do it themselves. A question that people often ask us is, can we predict the identity of the potential queen in the presence of the queen? People always ask me, you remove the queen, one worker becomes. Who is this one worker? As human beings, I think we are terribly interested in knowing who is the next leader, who is the next queen. So it's an obvious question. But whenever people ask this question, I would always say, I don't think so. It's not at all obvious to us who the next one will be. But when this question is asked to me again and again, I realize that I'm being very casual about this, and I must take this question somewhat more seriously, and I must try to answer this question. Can we predict the successor even before the death of the old one or the removal of the old one? So I decided to take this very seriously, which means I told my next PhD student, your job would be to predict the identity of the successor before the death of the old queen, and if you do so, you will get a PhD degree. So I got a bright student. She spent 5 years working on this. She did many, many experiments. She published many papers. She discovered many things. But at the end of 5 years, she came and said, I'm sorry, I cannot predict who the successor is until the old one is removed. She showed, for example, well, we gave her a PhD, all right, but she could not succeed in predicting. She showed, for example, that the potential queens are completely mixed up with the workers, and they are not unique. In fact, she showed we cannot predict. The potential queen is not unique by any criterion. She is not the most dominant individual. She is not the individual with a different behavioral profile. She is not even the individual with the highest residual amount of ovarian development. She is not a little bit like the queen. In fact, till today, we cannot predict the success. Now, I have worked with these wasps for so many years that I find this quite charming. I'm no longer frustrated. I think it's so wonderful that the wasps have secrets for which I don't know the answer, which is kind of charming, but also means that we can keep doing much more work. The next student who came to the lab said, well, we don't know who the successor is, but do the wasps know who their next successor is? Do they know? Well, people said this is not really a scientific question. You cannot really answer this question through the method of science. How can you know the mind of a wasp? How can you know what a wasp knows and does not know? But she was persistent. She says, we must find out. So we spent a lot of time designing experiments which might answer this question. In fact, we designed experiments, we performed experiments, and we discarded the data because we realized there's a flaw in our logic. But after many such attempts, we hit upon an experimental design which I think we can answer this question. The experiment seems complicated, but actually it's very simple, and I will illustrate this in a simple way. So the question we are asking is it possible that there is a Heir Designate, even though we cannot identify her? Do the other wasps know who their Heir Designate is? Now, the way we set about finally performing the experiment to answer this question is the following. We said, let us make the assumption, for the time being, that there is a Heir Designate, and everybody knows who except us. Let's make this assumption. And let's say, if this were true, what would be the consequences of this? How do we expect the wasp to behave in a certain experimental paradigm if these were true? If there was a Heir Designate and if they knew who it is, how would they behave? So we went back to the experiment where we cut the colony in half and put a wire mesh. So we said, let's take a colony, let's cut it in half, let's put half the workers and the queen on one side, randomly chosen, and the other workers on the other side. And one can imagine by logic that just by chance alone, the Heir Designate, because we are assuming there is one, is in fact on the opposite side of the queen. This can happen by chance. If that is true, then of course she has no difficulty. She will immediately become the potential queen, as in our other experiments. But she is supposed to be the Heir Designate for the whole colony, not only for her side, to test whether she is indeed the Heir Designate for the whole colony. We exchange her position with that of the queen. We take the queen from left to put it to the right, and we put her back here, and we say, even these workers should accept her as their next queen, because she is the Heir Designate of everybody. We put her back, she should have no problem. She should be acceptable both sides. However, this kind of situation can happen only in about half the experiments. Because in the other half experiment, just by chance alone, the unfortunate Heir Designate is sitting next to the queen, and she can't do anything about it. What we would expect here is that the best worker here would then become a potential queen. But this is not the Heir Designate for the whole colony, and when we move her here and bring her face to face with the true Heir Designate, in a situation where the queen is absent, there should be a problem. Because now this individual should think, I am the Heir Designate, and this individual says, I am already a potential queen, and in fact what we predict is that this individual should lose, and this individual should become a potential queen. So, and second individual should become hyper-aggressive, but that's not the end of the story. The acid test for this individual is that now we move her to this side, and she should be acceptable to the other side, which already had the previous individual as their potential queen. And that is the real proof. So our predictions are that the first potential queen should be unacceptable to the opposite side in about half the experiments, and a second one should emerge. But the second one should be acceptable to both sides, and there should never be a third contender to the throne, as it were, if you cut the nest in two parts. That's our prediction. Now, as you can imagine, these are very tedious experiments to do, because the wasps don't like so much disturbance. But spending 2 years, this student did this experiment 8 times. And she, in 3 out of 8 experiments, she found that there was no second potential queen. The first one was acceptable to both sides. But in 5 experiments, the first one lost out, the second one was acceptable to both sides. So in fact, both of these predictions were upheld. There was no potential queen 3. Both predictions are upheld, and therefore we argued that there is a Heir Designate, but she is cryptic to us. The wasps know who she is. Now what is our confidence in that the wasps know who she is? It turns out that the potential queen number 2 was never challenged. She was not challenged when she did not receive a single act of aggression, even by the potential queen 1, either when she met her there or when she went to the other side. Therefore, the Heir Designate was obviously known and acceptable to all the wasps. As soon as the PQ1 saw the Heir Designate, she voluntarily stopped being aggressive, and the potential Heir Designate became the second aggressive individual. So they all seem to know whose turn it is. So we always used to say, do you know who the success here is? Answer is no. But then we got a thrill by publishing a paper in which we say, we know that the wasps know. We don't know, but we know that the wasps know, because there are cryptic successors to the queen in Ropalidia. The next student who came to the lab said, how do you know there is a single Heir Designate? Maybe there is a whole line of Heir Designates waiting for their turn. So I said, do the experiment. So he would study all the wasps, remove the queen, identify the potential queen, remove her, and see what happens. Sure enough, he got a second one. Remove her, he got a third one. So you see, there is a Heir Designate even though we cannot predict, but is there just one Heir Designate or is there a queue? And he showed, in the presence of the queen, nobody shows aggression. Remove the queen, one and only one individual becomes hyper-aggressive. Remove her, one and only of the remaining. Remove her, one and only one of the remaining. And he showed this for 5 consecutive times and said, I have proved the principle. In fact, we carefully looked at whether these individuals are challenged, and it turns out they are not challenged. The red is the aggression they show, the blue is what they receive, which is almost always nearly 0. So they are unchallenged. And that's why we think there's a long reproductive queue of at least 5 potential queens. Perhaps the queue is even longer. Maybe everybody has a place in the queue and they're waiting for their turn. The question, of course, is this seems like so much peace, so much cooperation, so much order. Where is the conflict? And believe me, we were also stuck at this stage and said, we want to see some conflict. We were dying to see a fight. We want to see them fight. And they don't fight. They are so orderly organized, so well organized. In the presence of the queen, in the absence of the queen, the workers know what to do. They don't have to be told. We said, it can't be true. There must be some conflict. So I said, we want to see this conflict. So we designed specifically experiments to see whether we can uncover conflict. We know from human societies that when there is potential conflict, there are mechanisms to suppress this conflict. So we wanted to remove those mechanisms and bring the conflict to the fore. So we argued that the queen, we know now that the queen actually applies her pheromone to the nest. The way the queen communicates to the wasp is she has a pheromone and she keeps on applying it to the nest, and the wasps smell it from the nest. So we said the workers know they have a good queen because they are smelling the nest which has got pheromone. That's why they are not attacking the queen. But suppose we prevent the queen from applying the pheromone. The queen is there, but we don't allow her to apply her pheromone. Then the workers will think they don't have a good queen. The queen thinks I'm there, and there should be conflict. So we can uncover potential conflict. How do you prevent the queen from applying the pheromone? People suggested that you must block the opening from which the pheromone flows out. Put some nail polish, put some paint on it. And I said, that's too disruptive. I don't want to do that. But we came up with a different design. The queen applies the pheromone to the nest, which is usually 2-3 centimeters by 2-3 centimeters. We said, suppose we take away the nest. Where will she apply? So we brought all the wasps, the queen and the workers from nature, and we put them in a cage with no nest. So we said, now the queen cannot apply her pheromone, and workers should attack her, and she should be overthrown. It turned out that we did this experiment several times, and the queen was not overthrown. So why was she not overthrown? So we looked carefully, and we found that she was frantically applying her pheromone all over the cage. She was almost like a mad wasp, running around all the time applying. But then we said, even if she does that, the concentration per unit area is very less. And the workers must sense this. And indeed, they sensed it because they attacked her. But why did they not overthrow her? Because she fought back. She was confident that I am a good queen. So in fact what happened was that the queen continued to rub her abdomen on the walls of the cage and thus maintained her status, but the workers attacked her, which they never do in normal colonies. And the queen retaliated. She almost never shows aggression. So there is possibility of aggression. Workers can attack the queen if they think she is no good, and the queen can attack the workers if they don't respect her. But what is impressive is they maintain order and they do not need to use these behaviors, but they are there. They are hidden underneath, and we can uncover them by doing experiments. So there is potential for conflict that's usually prevented from coming to the fore. We did one more experiment, and I suppose everybody would ask me, how do the wasps treat their neighbors? How do they treat wasps from other colonies? There must be aggression there. So we brought all the wasps from a neighboring colony and introduced it into the cage of this colony. And we found to our great surprise that the response of the resident wasps to the introduced wasp was not simple. It was very complex, it was very nuanced, it was very graded. They treated different wasps differently. Just to summarize the results, when the members of one colony were introduced into the cage of another colony, the young alien workers freely admitted to the colony. No problem, come and join us. No aggression. But the older alien workers were allowed to live, but only away from the nest. You can live in that corner, but don't come to my house. And the alien queen was located wherever she was, and she was physically killed. So there was a very nuanced behavior. The wasps do not simply treat neighbors in one fashion, but they go through all of this. So thus the residents showed very nuanced, differential treatment to the intruders. Now then we ask, but the young ones are allowed to join. How are they treated? As humans, we can always ask this are the most interesting question. What happens to these ones who are accepted? It turns out that young alien workers who are accepted into foreign colonies become completely integrated into their foster colonies. They can become normal workers, they can become foragers, they can even become future queens. And in fact, the probability of a foreign worker becoming a queen is directly proportional to the number of foreigners. So there is no discrimination once they join. They're completely integrated. The series of questions and answers can continue indefinitely. I have chosen a set of question and answer to give you not only idea of praise my wasps, they do wonderful things, but also seriously to tell you how we have done these things and why we think we probably have understood. The question, of course, is why should we care? There are many reasons why we should care. I will certainly not suggest that we should imitate animal societies or anything in nature. But I am convinced that they can hold a mirror to us and offer us a means to reflect on our own society and to learn more about ourselves. And I think that is a great value. We always need a mirror to understand ourselves, and I think that's something they definitely do for us. I'll just close by making one remark that I take special pleasure in doing inexpensive research, which doesn't require much money, doesn't require much equipment, but requires brain power. And I have only one brain, so I work with a lot of students. And I have very few equipment in my laboratory. And sometimes this is a little bit embarrassing because there's a tradition in India when you have a visitor to show him your sophisticated instrument facility. And sometimes people ask me, where is your sophisticated instrument facility? Do you have any? I said, yes, I do. These are my sophisticated instruments. All my students with whom I enjoy working all the time, discussing over coffee, over tea, and planning experiments and throwing away the results and planning another experiment. I like to do research like this, and it's great fun. So between the wasps and the students, it's great fun, and the questions are endless, and I hope we can go on for a very long time. It's been a great privilege to share some of this with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure that there will be questions. Antoine Danchin.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating, and the way you present things are marvelous, I would say. I was just wondering whether this could be extended to societies of species which are different, which work together. Do you have ideas about how it? I even was thinking about microbial society.
Yes. In fact, there are many examples of microbes, of insects, of spiders, of shrimps, and of birds and mammals. In biology, the devil is in the details. So the details may be different, but I am confident that there are general principles to be learned which apply across all species. So there are many people working on these species. The only thing is I consciously made the decision that as an individual I will not study many species because then I will be superficial about it. I think there should be many people studying many species, spending their whole lifetime falling in love with a species, and then we will have lots of general. Well, to be fair to say, there is already a great deal of such information from microbial. In fact, yesterday I saw a paper about conflict in a virus society. So you can start from viruses, not even from bacteria, and I think there are general principles to be learned, and if more and more people work in these areas, we will have such general principles.
Question?
Yes, I have one.
Yeah. Eric?
Fascinating. Thank you very much. Beautiful. So now, the alien queen, how is it recognized? Is it because there is a different blend of pheromones?
Yes, there is a different blend of pheromone, and it is through smell they will recognize. Actually, they will also recognize the workers. They will also recognize whether they are young. You can see, because they have to give this differential treatment. It is mostly smell, but it is possible that it is 90% smell and 10% behavior. The queen may behave differently. The young individuals may. So we cannot be sure that it's only chemical. We are sure that chemical is a part of it, but it's also possible that behavior is involved in this.
So now going back to your molecular biology training, so what do we know about the genomics and transcripts and transcriptomes there? Do we know which genes are involved in the workers, in the bees, or in the queen? And
in this species, we do not know, but in similar species, people have now started looking, well, in some species now we have the genome. In some species, people have started looking at which genes are activated, turned up and turned down when an individual becomes a queen. Not quite in this kind of species, but in honeybees, for example. See, in honeybees, you can take a larva and you can feed her royal jelly, she'll become a queen. You don't feed her royal jelly, she'll become a worker. So in the laboratory, you can feed royal jelly and look at gene expression. You can deny royal jelly, look at gene expression. And people have started identifying this. People have also identified that there are epigenomic markers which will come up when an individual changes. But it's still not very clear which is the cause and which is the effect. This is very difficult to tease out. Do you have a certain gene activated, a certain epigenetic marker coming up because I became a queen? Or is that why I became a queen in the first place? This is going to be very hard to
Thank you very much. Anyway, thank you very much.
Olivier Perron. Same question, so.
Okay.
Oui.
Yeah. So the pheromone which blocks the worker to become a queen is a contact pheromone, because you say it's not volatile pheromone, it's a contact one?
We think it's a contact pheromone. So what we did was we saw that the queen applies it to the nest. We did many experiments to understand how the workers sense it. And our first hypothesis was they sense it every time they touch the queen in a physical interaction, they get a little bit of it. So we did experiments and we built some models and we showed that that cannot be true. Because the absence of the queen is understood so quickly, but the rate at which they interact is not enough. So the model said that cannot be true. Then we tried a model in which we said the potential queen doesn't have to touch the queen, the potential queen has to touch somebody who has touched the queen. So we worked out a model of a relay mechanism. So we calculated all possible pathways of information flow from the queen to the potential queen, and we did some mathematical analysis and found the shortest path. And even that was not quick enough compared to the behavior. Then we watched more carefully behaviorally, and we found that she's actually applying to the nest. So we looked at the underside of the wasp, and there is an opening there. So we traced that, and we found a gland, which is called the Dufour's gland. And we suspected that the pheromone is inside this Dufour gland. So the first thing we did was we removed the gland, we mashed it up, and we said, we will apply this to the nest. So we remove the queen, and instead of returning the queen, we apply the queen pheromone, or what we think is the queen pheromone, and the wasp should think that the queen has returned, meaning the potential queen should go back to work. That's exactly what happened. So we are able to show that it comes from here. Then, of course, we put that through a gas chromatographic mass spectral analysis. It turns out, first I thought, unfortunately, now I probably say fortunately, it's not one compound. There is no compound which is uniquely present in the queen, no compound which is uniquely present in the worker. The set of 20 to 30 compounds, and their ratios are what vary. So it's the cocktail of the queen is different from the cocktail of the workers. Now, by following this cocktail, we were able to show that from the day the queen is removed, in about 6 days, the cocktail of the worker changes in multidimensional space to become indistinguishable from the cocktail of the queen. So on the day 0, the cocktail of the worker is indistinguishable from the cocktail of any worker. After 6 days, the cocktail of the potential queen is indistinguishable from any other queen. So there is metabolism happening during that week in which the entire cocktail changes to that of the queen. Yes.
What is known about, it's a chemical question, what is known about the structure or the structures of both contact and volatile pheromones you are talking about? Especially, my question is mainly concerned with the contact pheromone.
Yes.
What do you know about the structure of the molecules involved?
We have been able to name the molecules based on the reference libraries. But there are 30 molecules, we haven't done anything more than that. But people are also working on this in other species, so we don't know too much. But based on the reference library, I think we are able to identify every compound. These are really long chain hydrocarbons.
Coming back to your preceding answer about the cocktail of the queen, does
Yes.
it mean that the cocktail of the queen is a constant, meaning that this is the same for one queen than for the next one and so on? And is it different from one place to the other?
It must be the same from one queen to the next because we actually have followed the cocktail from the time a worker becomes the potential queen until she becomes the next queen. So when she starts laying the egg, her cocktail is at least statistically indistinguishable from any other queen. So in a given colony, it must be the same. So then we asked, what about foreign colony? And this was an interesting question because what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at the effectiveness of the potential queen. So we said, this is a different queen. So we got the cocktail from the foreign queen and we applied it. Okay. Now we thought that they must attack this, but no, they accepted this and they actually stopped being aggressive. But there's a complication here. We suspect that the cocktail presented by the queen by applying to the nest is only sufficient to give information about fertility. Is it a queen or a worker? But whether it belongs to this nest or that nest, there's another cocktail. And if the real queen comes from outside, she carries both the cocktails. She says, I'm a queen and I'm a foreigner. Then they attack her. If you only say, I'm a queen, then they accept her. So it may be that we have actually broken this link between I'm a queen and I'm a foreigner. So it is more complicated. We have to study this. But we can show that you can break this and you can make the workers basically bow to a foreign queen by simply taking the Dufour-Klein cocktail.
Monsieur Janvier.
First of all, thank you very much for your superb talk. It was absolutely wonderful. I have one question about the possibility of knowing how such complex traits of behavior arose during evolution, and possibly through a comparative approach based on the phylogeny, either a molecular-based phylogeny or morphology-based phylogeny, and see if we can possibly disentangle why if this process was stepwise in evolution.
Yes, this is a very active topic of research. The phylogenetic part is now being done by many people. So, for example, I would give the input for one species. There will be many other people who would give input for a species. This is being done, and many cases people have found that some trait arises once and then it spreads through all the descendant species. Sometimes traits get lost. But there is a debate in our community in this area. To what extent were novel genes or even novel mutations required for reaching this kind of social evolution, and to what extent one could modify existing things to readapt to social evolution. This is a big debate in our field, and the debate is not settled. There are people who believe that the entire machinery for being a highly social creature is already present in a solitary insect. You just have to put them to the right use. There are other people who believe that the new mutations, new genes were actually required in order to be able to do something. So this is a debate, and it's being worked out. But people are very actively working in this area. Thank you.
Yes, you explained that in the case of bees, the queen can lay like up to 1,000 eggs a day.
In the honeybees.
Yeah, honeybees. Yeah, honeybees. And in the case of Ropalidia, you said that the behavior is quite the same as the workers. And then how many eggs does she lay? And she needs time for doing that. I'm surprised that you don't see such a different behaviors because she
lays
needs a lot of
very
time
few
to
eggs.
do that.
She lays very few eggs.
Okay.
She can. In her lifetime, I think the average number of eggs she would lay is less than one per day.
S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, if there is any other question, many thanks again. Many thanks.
Thank you.
I would like to come in here. Because you remember on September 27th, you signed the document.
Yes.
That's a paper.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
That's
Thank you.
science and fact.
Yes.